All right, welcome everyone. There are a few folks who are still joining, but wanted to go ahead and kick us off here. Welcome to the first session of this year's Stakeholder Summit. We're so glad to have you. My name is Gwen Stembridge. My pronouns are she, her, and I get to serve as Equality Ohio's statewide civic engagement director. And I'm so excited to welcome you to this first session about movement ecology. The first thing that I'm going to do is I really want to make sure we take time to thank our sponsors. So one of our sponsors for this morning, the first sponsor, Equitas Health. So thank you so much, Equitas, for your support of the Stakeholder Summit. We know that Equitas does so much good work providing healthcare for the LGBTQ community and those living with HIV, and we're so grateful. We partner with Equitas on a lot of things and are so grateful for their support today. So that's just some appreciation for Equitas here. And then the next thing that I will do, we have a greeting here from our state senator, from our senator, or Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown. So I'm gonna make sure that I share, make sure I share correctly here, so that you can hear this video greeting from Senator Sherrod Brown.
I'm Sheriff Brown. It's an honor to represent you in the United States Senate. Welcome to Equality Ohio's annual Stakeholder Summit and happy Pride Month. I want to thank Equality Ohio for your work for 16 straight years now. Thank you for your courage, for your activism, to your stepping up to advance social justice and equality across our great state. You've always been on the right side of history. Because of you, Ohio is safer, it's more inclusive than it's ever been. In 2017, I introduced the Senate's first ever resolution, officially recognizing June as Pride Month. I've led that same resolution every year since. As we celebrate Pride Month, we must continue fighting for equality with our LGBTQ family, friends, and neighbors, not just in the month of June, of course, but all year round. During these last 4 years, all of you stepped up to fight back against a hostile administration that repeatedly tried to eliminate protections for LGBTQ communities. Now, for the first time in 4 years, we have a president who's officially recognized Pride Month. Under his leadership, his administration has affirmed that housing and lending discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity are out and out illegal. That's why we must pass the Equality Act to ensure our LGBTQ friends have these protections codified. There's so much momentum behind this bill now, but we need to keep hearing your voices and your stories. One of my favorite Dr. King quotes in his letter from the Birmingham jail, he wrote, "Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability." Think about that. Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. You know that as activists. You know that as advocates, you know that as fighters for justice, that it rolls in because you make it so. Thank you. Happy Pride Month.
Wonderful. We're grateful for those words from Senator Sherrod Brown to kick us off today. And they are such a good reminder as we go into this movement ecology training that there are so many different ways that we are advocating, and we have to take that action. It is not inevitable. We have to take those actions. So the next thing I want to do is introduce our speaker for today. Alwiyah Shariff is an incredible organizer and is even before her work with Ohio Voice, has been doing all kinds of things in progressive spaces. And now in her role with Ohio Voice, she has done this training for our staff at Equality Ohio. And we wanted to open this up to our community and really start the whole week with this as a framework for the ways that we do this advocacy work. We know that there are so many different lanes to this work, and that it's important for us all to be in relationship with one another as we're doing this. So we see the Stakeholder Summit as an opportunity to build on those connections and to really move our LGBTQ plus movement fiercely forward in Ohio. So I'm going to turn it over to Alwiyah now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gwen. Good morning, everyone. I hope y'all are arriving well or as well as possible on this Monday. I know, yeah, anyways. So I'm Alwiyah. I go by she, her. I live in Columbus, and yeah, I have been organizing for a little over 10 years now. I started out actually organizing when I was 17. Didn't realize that that's what I was doing. I'm an immigrant. So, like, when I moved here, I was always, yeah, like, felt like I had to stand up for my mom. She doesn't speak very well. She didn't at that time, at least. She had like a thick accent. She wore hijab, and moving here from New York City, where there's like a lot of diversity, it was just very different, right? Ohio was just like, I think at least at that time, it wasn't very used to having different types of cultures, right? And yeah, so I was always like somebody who had an opinion, whether you asked for it or not, and eventually got involved in some like youth work, and from there, really did a lot of like, I started out mostly doing advocacy work, and then eventually got burnt out from that. For me, it wasn't moving fast enough, so I was like, I'll be the politician, the person sitting on the other side of the table, and I'll be the person making change. And oh, we have two people in the waiting room. One more. But yeah, so I'll be the other person, the person on the other side of the table, and then worked at the State House for about a year. Got super burnt out from that. Realized that it doesn't really matter what you do, because these people are at least most of the people, they didn't really care, right, about what needs to actually happen, like what's gonna be the best for our community. It was a lot of like ego trips and such. And it like, I remember being 18 and being like, oh, no wonder why we're so fucked. Oh, sorry, I like cuss. But no wonder why, like, the state is the way that it is because these are the people running it. And so I very quickly became disenchanted by the system, and ended up just doing like just random jobs that year. I think I had like probably 8 jobs in one year. I was like a receptionist. I worked at a car dealership. I worked at a warehouse. Like, I did almost anything you can imagine. And then eventually went to school, and ended up connecting with this organization called the Ohio Student Association, that was doing a lot of work at OSU campus. They were involved in like lots of different things, like the campaign around Wendy's, the what was the other campaign that was like hot at OSU at that time? It was the campaign around like sweatshops, and yeah, just like a bunch of different campaigns. But they had a very clear analysis of like power and organizing, and like, building up structure and stuff like that. So I ended up really like connecting with them, and then ended up getting involved in mostly like movement for Black Lives work, because we had a series of like police shootings happening that summer. I think it was 2013 going on 2014. And it really kind of like woke us up, and we started getting connected with other organizations across the country, like in Florida, North Carolina, Mississippi, California, New York, and really realized like there needs to be a national movement, right? This isn't just an Ohio issue or a Florida issue. And there were this high profile murders happening. And so we got together and created an organization called the Freedom Side Network, which was really trying to sort of like uplift this as a national issue. And our tagline was "Our Lives Matter," right? Black Lives Matter, immigrants' lives matter, queer lives matter. And then probably like a month to that date is when Mike Brown got killed, and sort of the Black Lives Matter movement kind of like took off. And so I really spent a lot of energy in that work for a few years, until I got really burnt out, right? It's not easy being in the front lines, and thinking that you're gonna start a political, like a revolution. I remember being in my 20s being like, a revolution is coming. And then we had like these little wins here and there, but then ultimately things kind of went back to normal. So then I kind of came back to Ohio. I did some union organizing, ended up in New York doing 15 campaign. That's a whole nother story. And then came back, did some civic engagement work. I was the civic engagement director for about a year, which was like a really great experience for me. And then eventually started working with the Working Families Party, and then came back to Ohio back in, I think I was back in 2019, and became, and then started working for Ohio Voice, managing our fellowship program, which was like a really great way for me to kind of come back into organizing. Because up to that point, I think like I had learned a lot, and I think running a fellowship program, getting to sort of like work with just like a particular set of people, like young people, was really, really powerful for me to be able to like share all the knowledge. And actually Kelly Fox, who's one of the folks that organized this, was one of our fellows, and it was just like amazing to get to know them and to just see like how far a lot of people have come, like from 2019 to now. And so for me, it's really exciting to like be here with y'all and kind of also share what I know. This material I know was really helpful for me when I was starting to organize, to sort of like help me think about how do I orient myself to this larger context and this larger movement. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my okay, great. So this is our agenda for today. We're gonna do a quick welcome, which we just did, and then we're gonna do some like introductory questions, and then kind of go into the movement ecology framework. I'll do a presentation, probably about 10 minutes. And then depending how the energy feels, we'll break into like breakout groups to kind of do a deeper analysis and a deeper dive of some of the concepts that we're talking about. And then we'll come back and sort of debrief it as a large group. And from there. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Cool. And if you have any questions, like Gwen said, feel free to put it in the app, or Taraj will help, I'm sure, like read the questions, hopefully, because for me, it's hard to look at the chat and also train at the same time. But also I'm a popular education trainer, which means that I really like for folks to be actively engaged. So I'm gonna naturally just like ask questions, you know, kind of get y'all to like jump in when, if you know something, like I genuinely believe that the knowledge is already in the room. I'm just here to facilitate and help kind of like make it make sense, hopefully. But if anybody has anything to add at any point or anything like that, feel free to jump in. Cool. So what we're going to do, I think folks already started putting their introductions in the chat, but we're going to do name, pronouns, if you want to give us your city, if you're affiliated with an organization, and what are you looking to learn? And I also like this fun question around like, what is your leadership style? Because as Gwen was talking, right, it's like, y'all are a part of like multiple different movements, right, and organizations, but also within your organizations, you're probably working with lots of different people, right? And so when we're talking about organizing, which is, I personally think is one of the hardest things you can be doing, because you're trying to organize people, right? And people are probably the hardest resource, most complicated. And so I think as much as possible that we can give ourselves like frameworks and ways to kind of make it make sense is really helpful. This is an exercise that we did when our organization was first forming that I found really useful. So basically it's a leadership compass, and I'm sure there's multiple versions of this, but this is the one that I really like, and you can also Google it if you're interested. But basically it breaks it down to northwest, east, south. So it says, you know, northern leaders are the type of leaders that are very much like executives, right? They make quick decisions. They're usually the type of people that are going to be in front of the room, They're very much like good at leading and kind of like getting people like galvanized, right? And then you have Southern leaders who are very much driven by relationships, right? They really care about how people feel. They, in a room, they're really paying attention to like the vibe of the room, right? Who's talking, who's not talking? Does everyone have their needs? That's sort of like the main way that the Southern leaders will lead. And then you have your Eastern leaders who are very creative, like big vision, like big picture type thinkers, that are really like, they're not necessarily, they might be looking at the small details, but they're looking at the larger picture, right? And then you have your Western leaders that are a lot more detail oriented. They sometimes might not care how you feel, or like might not be interested in the bigger vision necessarily, or like what the big fancy story is going to be, but they're going to get the mission done, right? They're going to be the people that kind of are going to be very detail oriented and be able to get that. So what I'm going to have us do is, actually, how much time do we have? Have us do is, maybe if you want to add this on too into your actually, I'm going to have us break out into groups. I'm going to do a quick pair share with somebody random. And then what you're going to do is, how do I do this? What you're going to do is go ahead and introduce yourself. So say your name, your pronouns, what affiliation you're with, and then give us, and then talk a little bit about what is your leadership style. Welcome back. Welcome back. Thanks everyone for participating. How was that for folks? Does anyone wanna, and I meant to say this too before I broke y'all out, was like thinking about it, like what is your primary leadership and maybe your secondary? Because I'm sure some of y'all were probably like, I'm like for me, for example, I'm definitely a Southeast. I primarily lead with my with like the emotional piece of it, but I'm also a very much big thinker. So I'm sure some of y'all probably saw yourselves like around this. But does anyone want to share any reflections?
Don't be shy. We want to hear from you if you're willing to share.
If this was your first time, like how was it? Or have y'all seen these before?
This is new to me, so the two of us were a little bit confused about what our leadership style would be. And I'm assuming it's probably common that sometimes you might be a blend depending on who you're working with.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
I'm two different styles as well, but then I was trying to capture the chart and then it disappeared before I captured it, so I forget what direction would mean.
No. I'm sorry.
I have vision impairment, so sometimes if something is there, I try to quickly capture the image before it disappears, but sometimes I can't do it quickly enough.
Yeah. For sure. Awesome. Well, thank you for participating. But yeah, definitely I hear it like you can definitely be multiple leadership styles, right? And I was sharing with Gwen, like for me, I've learned over the years to be the style that's gonna like fit into the team, right? Or the certain project or the session. But it's just really good to be aware of like, there are multiple different styles. And I know for us, like when we started working together, when with the team that I was working with when I first did this training, there was like starting to be a little bit of conflict because some people were like, oh, like some people aren't doing enough, or some people are doing more, or some people felt like, they weren't like, they didn't care at all, right? And the way we did this exercise, it was actually like a half a day training, right? And they had us actually go across the room and be like, okay, all the northern leaders go on this side of the room, west, south, and then they had the people kind of like discuss, okay, what are the strengths of our leadership style, what are the weaknesses, and then then they had people talk to each other across a room. So it ended up being like really powerful to notice, like, oh, all those people over there, like I thought they were this type of way, but really it's just the way that they lead, right? This is just like how they primarily, like, this is what they prioritize. And so it was really helpful to sort of navigate, like from there forth, like navigate how you work with people in teams. So I just find this really useful to think about as I'm working with people. But yeah, awesome. Cool. So let's get into the material. So movement ecology. So basically, movement ecology is a concept that I came across about 6 years ago, and it comes from this organization called the INE Institute, and out of it came momentum and momentum organizing and momentum theory. And basically what when I took this training, it was like a day and a half training. And I think at this point they've also done like a 3-day training, and now I think they have a 7-day training that's sort of like a part 1 and part 2. And over the past year, I've sort of broke it down to be an hour training, like an hour and a half to do over Zoom. So I just wanted to say, like, this is a lot of information and it could be like a huge concept to cover, but for the sake of us, again, being on Zoom, kind of doing it this way, yeah, like we're still gonna like get a lot of out of it, but just kind of wanted to name that there is a lot that we could talk about that we might not have time for in this session, and that's totally okay, right? It's okay to leave with questions and sort of figure out like, okay, how do we follow up from here? But basically, movement ecology is again, a framework that basically tries to sort of understand like how do social movements actually happen, right? So some of the organizers from INE Institute, Carlos Saavedra and Paul Engler, who are amazing organizers. I think Paul Engler actually just wrote a book with his brother that's been out there that I'm blanking on the name right now. But they're folks that you can definitely feel free to look up. And they basically, what they did was they were trying to figure out, actually, let me back up. They're organizers from the immigrants' rights movement. So Paul was one of the organizers out in California. I want to say it was back in like 2012 or 2013 when they had these huge like immigrant rights protests and marches happening across California. That was really, really important, I think, for the larger immigrants' rights movement. And so they were able to organize like tens of thousands of people across California, actually across the country, to really think about the issues that were happening within that. And, they were trying to sort of figure out, like, how do we sort of build the social movement, right? How do social movements across the country, across the world happen? And what they did was they studied different cultures, different societies, different, like movements across history. And what they figured out, obviously you can see from this tree that there's many, many ways that social movements happen, right? And what they were trying to sort of figure out is like, how do we have a framework, a way to sort of talk about this with other people, right? Because again, we were trying to build social movements here in the United States. And so what they did was they tried to distill it into like 5 theories of change. And a theory of change, or your approach to change is basically like, what is your theory of how change happens, right? What is your theory of how social movements happen? And it's really important to understand what is your theory of change, what is your organization's theory of change, and maybe what's the theory of change for your larger movement, because it really is going to help you sort of think about like, what is my approach, right? What is the strategy? What are the different tools and tactics that we're using? And so what we really found that it's really important for the individual to really get clear on like, what are the different theories of changes that are out there, and what is my personal theory of change, right? So again, so we know how to relate to other people, and how are we sort of like strategically building these movements, right? Because there's a lot of vocabulary and analysis and all these things that are out there. And so the clearer that we can be about what is the shared vocabulary that we have, what is the shared analysis that we have, it's going to make our work hopefully a lot easier, or at least a little bit easier. So before I get into it, I really like to present the slide to think about the modes of learning. So most adults, when we learn, like first we understand the material. If we understand it enough, we will appreciate it, right? Once we appreciate it, if we're like, oh wow, I really like this, we're gonna want to experiment with it, right? So for me, for example, like when I took this training, I was like, okay, this is great. Like I really understand that it's clicking, really appreciate this material. And then eventually sort of like it started integrating it into my own personal work, right? And experimenting with it and using it in the way that we sort of build our movements. And then from there, you know, endorsing it. So like, I'm here training on this material because I think it really works. And so what we're gonna ask you to do in the next, in the next hour or so, is to really stay in the understanding and appreciating mode. And eventually, if you appreciate it enough, would love for y'all to experiment with it and then eventually endorse. So like I said, theory of change is, what is your theory of how social movement, what is your theory of change and how change happens? And we're talking about social movements. And the reason why we also use the ecology is obviously because, you know, when we think about the ecology, you need multiple things, right? You need the sun, the earth, right? The dirt, the grass, like you need all of it in order to have like something that's healthy. And so that's how we sort of want to think about this. How do we build healthy movements? So this is the movement ecology slide, the introduction to movement ecology slide that I was saying. And yeah, sort of breaking down like, yeah, it's an ecology. We wanted to, in order to have healthy movements as well, we want to think about how do we look at it like we're having a healthy ecology. This is the modes of learning. Like I said earlier, would love for y'all to stay in the understanding and appreciating mode for the next hour. And then eventually maybe, yeah, want to experiment and endorse with it. And then this is the slide that I had up when I was talking about, how Paul and Carlos and a bunch of other people really looked at like what are the hundreds and maybe thousands of ways that social change can happen across time, across different cultures. They really studied the Akpor movement in Serbia, in India, here in the United States, the civil rights movement, civil resistance movement, and really from there kind of distilled it like, okay, so what are the 5 major ways that change actually happens, and really try to again develop a framework for the rest of us to sort of understand and sort of break down. So hopefully like our work can be a little bit easier, because you know when we have a shared analysis and a shared language, it's going to be, you know, obviously a lot easier to work together. Can y'all still see the slide with the trees? Okay, great. At any point too, if you lose me again, please let me know and I'll restart it. Great, I love this slide. So it's that, this quote, so it says, we don't know who discovered the water, but we know it wasn't the fish. And the story goes is that there were 2 fish swimming in the water, and then, they were swimming, and then another fish swims by and looks at them and says, hey, the water is great, right? And like keeps swimming. And then like a few minutes later, the fish look at each other and it's like, wait, what's water? And the idea is like a lot of us have been swimming in certain waters, right? In certain like theories of change. And we might not even know that we are in that theory of change, right? And so what we're going to try to do is sort of get you out of that water so you could see like what are the other rivers and lakes and ponds that are out there, and from there sort of you can decide like how do we relate to that, right? How do we actually work together and see ourselves in this larger ecosystem? So I said earlier that there's 5 approaches to change, but we're going to start with 3 and then break it down. And then what I'm going to do is sort of kind of give a definition of each approach and then give a few examples. And again, would love for y'all to add in if you have anything to add. And then from there, we'll like break it down even further. So the 3 approaches to social change that they sort of found were personal transformation, building alternatives, and changing dominant institutions. So we'll start with alternatives. So folks whose theory of change is building alternatives really believe that the way that social change happens is by building alternative institutions, right? So these folks really believe that the way things are right now are so like rotten to the core that there's no way that we could actually change it. One of the only ways that social change can happen is by building all new alternatives, right? So this is like building cooperatives, so meaning cooperative banks, what's it called, having like mutual aid programs, right? Having sort of alternative ways of being able to support our communities. And a quote that comes from alternatives is building the new world in the shell of the old, is really the idea that building alternatives that can then be sort of the new dominant, right? The new sort of institutions that are what like communities want to use. Some examples of alternative institutions are the Gem City Market. Has anyone heard about the Gem City Market out in Dayton, or can give us some information about it? Do we have any folks from Dayton in here? Okay, cool. So the Gem City Market is this awesome market that just opened up. Actually, they had their grand opening, I think, a few weeks ago in Dayton. And basically, Dayton is one of the cities that very much has, like, they call a food desert, right? Where you can go for, like there's certain, probably like 2 or 3 neighborhoods in a row that don't have a grocery store at all, right? It's like probably the closest grocery store is 20 minutes away. And it's just really difficult for people to find like fresh fruit, right? Fresh vegetables, and just have basic groceries aside from the convenience stores. And Cleveland is also considered a food desert. There's a lot of different sort of cities and towns and villages in our state that are considered this. But what Dayton tried to do, what they did do, was that they had been organizing, I would say for at least the last like 6 to 10 years, was organize the Gem City Market, where they're able to basically have like a free store, right? So it's the type of store where like if you can, then you come in and you pay for your food, and you can't, you don't. And it's been like such a huge community effort where it's owned by the community, right? It's one of the few co-ops that's in the state, I think, that really is such a feat like this, right? They were able to get lots of sponsors from across the state. They did a lot of small donor. How it really started was basically they started knocking on doors on their neighbors and really trying to figure out like, okay, what is the need in this community, right? And they figured out like there's not a grocery store, and so really started a grassroots effort to where now it's a brick and mortar grocery store that's really beautiful. So I would encourage y'all to look into it. Another alternative is what is this? Oh yeah, that's the Gem City Market. And then we also have the transformative justice movement. We consider this as an alternative because it's an alternative to the incarceral system, right? For the last few years, there's been this movement that's saying that, we know prisons and jails aren't necessarily rehabbing people, right? And so what we really need to do is have an alternative way of our justice system, right? So really having ways that's more thinking about the individual, right? Sort of having a whole different process that's going to be alternative to what's already existing. And we also have an organization here in Columbus called Healing Broken Circles. This is just one example of an alternative organization where what they've been doing is sort of going into the jails and prisons and running programming, right? As an alternative to what's already existing within the jails. And so, and they're doing like yoga, they do different, sort of like workshops and helping people get certificates and GED programs, and really like coming in there as a way to like a different way of like supporting people. Does anyone have anything else to add when it comes to alternative institutions, or have any examples to add to alternative organizations?
I would just add, I love seeing all of the mutual aid projects that came up around the pandemic. And so like mutual aid, that's another one, kind of creating those, lots of folks have kind of created those alternative solutions. And that's been really cool to watch.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Are folks with me? Are we clear about approaching change through alternative institutions? Just give me like a thumbs up. Does anyone have any questions? Because I really want us to get clear on some of these before we like do our activity. Cool. Another example that I would add to alternatives is also the Black Panther Party in the from the civil rights era. The Black Panther Party did a great job of creating the breakfast program. Have y'all heard of this? So basically at that time, you know, lots of kids in Chicago were just not getting proper breakfast, right? Proper meals in order to go to school. And so what they did was they created a program where they would give free breakfast to children. And so they did that for a number of years until, and then the federal government ended up picking up that program, right? To where like now, well, ideally what's supposed to happen is most kids are supposed to get a free breakfast in school, right? And that came from this alternative program from the Black Panther Party. And then eventually, like I said, it's now, you know, part of these dominant institutions like, you know, K through 12 and like the federal government. And so that's just like one example of how an alternative program, an alternative institution can become something that's part of the mainstream. Another way of approaching social change is through personal transformation. So personal transformation folks really believe that the way that change happens is through personally transforming people, right? So they really believe like if the individual is better, therefore the world is going to be better, right? And there's multiple ways that you can also approach personal transformation. Here you can do it through mentoring, through fellowship programs. You can do it through sort of some like direct service programs, right? Like Toys for Tots. I really put like social workers and even like the mutual aid programs too. I would put some of it. It's definitely an alternative, but it's also personal transformation, right? Because what it's trying to do is directly meet people's needs, right? It's like, okay, if you're hungry, I'm going to give you food. If you need shelter, I'm going to provide, you know, these services that are going to give you that shelter. And so personal transformation folks really believe that that's how, you know, change happens. This is also going to be through like wellness programs as well, right? Mental health programs, and some of the stuff that, some of like basically anything that's gonna make the individual sort of like be in a better mental space or in a better headspace, and also give them what they need in order to like have like a healthier, fuller life. Therefore, the world will be better. Is that, does anyone have any questions or anything to add to personal transformation?
I say this is a tough, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
This is a tough format, and I just wanted to say I can hear you, and I'm absorbing everything. This is my first time to attend, so just trying to give you a little bit of feedback. You're doing great. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Awesome. All right. So the third approach to social change, is going to be changing dominant institutions. So changing dominant institutions is basically the folks who, and I would say most of us probably work in this approach, is that we believe, folks in this in this approach believe that the way you change the way you make social movements happen, the way you change the world is through changing dominant institutions. And dominant institutions are those institutions that dominate our lives, right? They're the ones who come up with the rules for how we live our lives every day, basically, right? So this is going to be like governments, political parties, corporations, education system like K through 12 or higher ed learning, you know, unions, political parties, community organizations are also part of dominant institutional change, because these are organizations that are working within the dominant, like trying to change these dominant institutions most of the time. And we can also become a dominant institution ourselves, right? If we are the one, so community organizations are going to be a part of this. And then we also have social movements too that are part of changing dominant institutions, like Black Lives Matter, because they are, you know, I think Black Lives Matter is interesting because we can put them in multiple pieces. And I'm sure at this point you're picking up that, like, you know, like we need all of these approaches, right? And so it's interesting that even some movements can sort of be in multiple pieces of the pie. But yeah, Black Lives Matter is definitely part of changing dominant institutions through their mass protest work, and also, you know, multiple things that they've done. And yeah, does anyone have any other examples to add to changing dominant institutions, or like another definition?
I've been in this movement 43 years and was very active with a group that was outside of the United Church of Christ denomination, urging that denomination to become more welcoming of LGBT people. We'd stand outside with signs saying, "Let us in," maybe not literally, but metaphorically. Mm-hmm. Now LGBT is part of the structure of the church, rather than being a group of us outside saying, "Let us in." Mm-hmm. And then similarly, the Ohio State University, and where "the" is important, the OSU Gay Alliance was a student group that was only minimally recognized by the university. Now, 43 years later, well, not quite that much time, but now the LGBT is part of the whole, I need to add Q actually, is part of the structure of the university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so that's like two perfect examples of how, you know, these organizations were able to change sort of these dominant institutions, right? And it seems like y'all did it in multiple ways, which we're going to break down dominant institutions a little bit further. You could see here on the right that within changing dominant institutions, there's also multiple approaches. So it sounds like the first sort of example you gave was through mass protests, right? So standing out there, sort of like demanding to get in. And then sort of the second way is, and then eventually sort of like became a part of the process, right? A part of the structure. And so, I want to break it down a little bit further, because I feel like this is where, again, I think most of us end up, is that within changing dominant institute,
let me change very quickly my narrative very slightly. Mm-hmm. We never actually stood outside the church holding signs, because we were attending the General Synod and lobbying people and talking to local congregation. It wasn't quite the protest signs. I was saying that more metaphorically in both cases than literally standing outside the church.
Yeah. Okay.
So that probably happened somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure that happened somewhere, and it sounds like y'all did it through the inside game instead. But yeah, so changing dominant institutions, like we can also change them in multiple ways, right? So we can do that through mass protests, we can do that through structural organizing, or changing or the inside game. And I'll like break it down a little bit further. So you can change dominant institutions through, I'll start with mass protests, meaning that, you know, folks who are sort of in this mass protest lens, they really believe that the way change happens is through protest, right? If we're out in the streets, if we're showing the high sacrifice, right? If we're really out there, you know, people power, we have hundreds and thousands of people in the streets, and that's how change is going to happen, right? If we change the public's opinion, if we have mass protests outside, if we're doing lots of actions, if we're like making things really flashy and really trying to convince the public, this is really the aim of mass protests, is like convincing the public to believe in an issue and to sort of change their mentality about something. Therefore, then, you know, that's how we're going to change these dominant institutions, right, from the outside game. On the opposite of that, you have folks who are in the inside game. These people really believe that the way change happens is through being on the inside, right? So these are our lobbyists, our lawyers, folks who are running for office, people who are, you know, maybe might be having positions within some of these institutions, right? So they really believe that like the way change really happens is by being in the inside. If I'm the person rewriting the policy, if I'm the person, you know, helping to restructure the organization, doing some of that internal politicking, then that's how change is really going to happen. We also have a third option, which is structure organizing. This is actually the core of where I come. This is where I learned how to organize, is through structure. And basically, those who approach changing dominant institutions through structure organizing really believe that the way that we change it is by being really by having like a structured campaigns, right? So basically saying like, for example, if we know we want to, you know, organize a certain neighborhood, right? Or if we're like, all right, we want to organize a certain neighborhood, we might think like what we really need is to elect a new, what we want to do is elect a new city council member, for example. But we go into the community, we don't just go in there like, hey, let's elect a new city council member. We go in there and we talk to the community, right? Like, hey, what's going on, what are some issues? And we find out maybe the biggest issue is that there's no stop sign in this particular road, right? And people are like speeding up and down and it's really dangerous. So okay, great. So let's come up with a campaign and let's do something about that. So we talk to the neighbors, and then they say, and we're like, okay, let's get everyone together. Let's go to I don't know, our local town hall, and let's talk about it. So we go there, and then the leadership is like, actually, we don't think this is a big deal, da da da. So the community comes back and they're like, okay, well, they didn't listen to us. What are we gonna do? Okay, let's have a mass community meeting, and let's like, you know, let's try to vote these people out, and let's really demand that this is what we want. So they come back and they do their organizing, right? And they talk to more people, and then eventually they get their stop sign, and then they're like, oh wait, like why was that so difficult? It seems like we really need new leadership, right? It shouldn't have been that hard. And there's somebody in our community that we really want to run. Great, let's like do that campaign. And then you sort of like are very structured about it. And it's really thinking about long term, right? So it's not just doing a protest or doing these huge actions and then just to mobilize people, but you're really trying to bring people with you and organizing them for the long term. And it's not, again, just doing the inside game, which obviously can be really powerful, but sometimes, you know, you kind of get stuck in a little niche. And I'm sure some of y'all maybe have noticed at this point is like, we need all of these approaches to be really powerful, right? I mentioned a little earlier, like my story of organizing. Like I said, I really started out in structure where, actually, no, I would say I started more in the inside game because we were trying to change actual policy and such. And so I remember being in DC and being in these stakeholder meetings, sitting across the rooms with these people in their suits and stuff like that, and just being like, okay, like you look really nice and you sound really smart, but it's really difficult to actually, you know, have the change that we actually need. And the issues I was working around was foster care and youth homelessness issues, because I was staying at a shelter at that time. And so that's how I got involved into organizing, because they were like, okay, you're here, you have a lot to say, like how do we actually, you know, like get you involved, right? Because there was a lot of us. And what happened was there was another young person that was staying there who was 13 at the time, and the law in Ohio was like, if you were a male and you turned 14, you had to stay at the men's shelter instead of the family shelter. And he was only 14, like he was literally a little boy. So we were just like, okay, so what are we going to do about this? And so Angela, who was my mentor at that time, who I didn't realize was going to be my mentor, but she was like, okay, what do y'all want to do about this? Do you think we should change laws? Do you think we need to talk to people? Do we got to talk to these politicians? And so that's how I slowly got involved. And like I said, eventually we ended up changing it changing the federal law around this, and which was like really powerful. But then coming back to Ohio, it was like, okay, well, that's not enough. Now we have to shut down this shelter because it's actually not healthy at all, because it was a day shelter. So you basically stayed there during the day, and then every evening you slept somewhere else. And like, if you were at a location that had food, great. If you didn't, you had to stop it. It was just like a whole process. And I'm grateful that we only stayed there for the summer, but there were other people who were staying there for years, right? And it just didn't seem like it made sense to have these little kindergartners, having to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to school. And so we were like, okay, we need a shelter that's going to be stable. I think it's the YWCA up north now. But it took us 6 years to be in these meetings to even convince the neighborhood to have us there, because they're like, our property values are going to go down, blah, blah, blah. And so I quickly flipped, and that was me trying to do the inside game, and then saw it's no longer working. So then I flipped to mass protest. So I was like, all right, well, I guess we're just going to have to protest because this inside game isn't working. So we need to like shame you, basically. Right. And so from there, that worked. We mobilized a lot of people got involved, but then what were we going to do with all these people, all this energy? We had to absorb them into a structure, right? A structure that was really going to be able to give us what we need, and hopefully do more organizing past that. And so once the location was actually built, like at that point I stepped away, but I know now they have a lot of like personal transformation services that's involved, right? Like they have an actual like day camp and all these things are involved, and really trying to build some of those like alternatives that are going to be able to serve those people. So that's just like a very quick example to say that, like, there are like the punchline of this training is like all of these are really important, right? And we need all of these in order to make change, and to be able to recognize, like, again, like what is my theory of change? Like, how do I think change happen versus what is the organization that I'm working with, right? What is their theory of change? And how do we use that in a way to get the change that we actually need? And maybe recognizing what are the other organizations that is in our field, right? In our sphere, and how do we work together? Because again, if we think about the Black Panther Party, right, they were an organization that kind of tried to do, I don't know if folks are familiar with the history of the Black Panther Party, but I know I mentioned a little bit about their breakfast program, which was more of like, I would put them as like it was an alternative, right? An alternative program that they built to what was already happening with the community, but it was also personal transformation, right? Because they were like, actually feeding people, right? And they also did a lot of that work where they were doing a lot of like Black Power movement. And so they were really doing a lot of that personal transformation, and also doing a lot of protests, right? They were out in the streets. Like that's, I think, something that people, I think most people know them as that, right? When you look at the pictures and the flyers, but a lot of their one of the reasons why I think they really, ended up dissolving, right, is because of also their inside game. They were also running people for office. The first Black mayor in America was actually in Cleveland, Ohio, who was a Black Panther candidate. And so they were at a point where they were really doing a lot of, they were just like all over this map, right? Making some real changes. And then they got infiltrated by the CIA. And then there was just like a lot of interpersonal things. And then eventually they collapsed because they were trying to be all over this. And also, obviously, they were doing a lot of structural organizing because they were building chapters all across the country that were trying to do a lot of things. And so what we really try to say, it's important for us to be clear on, like, hopefully our lane. What lane is your organization in? What lane are you in? How do you do that really well? And how do you relate to other people? And if you are gonna sort of step into that other sort of pieces of the pie, how are you doing it in a way that's not gonna overwhelm you and exhaust you, right? Because again, there's multiple ways of approaching it, and we need everybody, right? So I'll pause there if there's any questions, thoughts, feedback before we move on. Like, is this making sense to folks? Does anyone have any questions? Do you have anything to add?
It's making sense. You know, it's amazing what kind of bad PR the Black Panther movement used to have when I was growing up. And it's so nice to know I have heard some of these things before, but it's really wonderful to learn that they were a lot different than how the media portrayed them.
I'll just add the importance of like everybody working in these different lanes, like being in communication and relationship with each other, right? And like there are folks who are working in the inside game who could be in touch with the folks who are doing the mass protest, and like how powerful is that if we're all kind of like aligned and moving toward the same thing when recognizing that we're in these different lanes. I just that gets me really excited.
Thank you. Does anyone have any examples or any other like organizations to add to any of this? Or like if you're thinking about your own work or your own organization or movement?
Any ideas on how to get the insurance companies to work with billables for some of these things?
Right. Sounds like the inside game. Or I don't know, I feel like I mean it's weird when you talk about, it's like everyone has insurance. Like everyone that I talk to as an adult has issues with the insurance companies in some way or another. So like, it's really interesting to see. Like I think there can definitely be a strong like inside game, right? Where it's like, let's have the people who are working with these insurance companies that also see this as an issue. I'm sure we have lots of, queer folks, all kinds of folks that are working in this industry that see these issues. How do we sort of organize them to sort of change the policies within, right? It's kind of like change the culture, but then also, like, why aren't there more mass protests? Like, I'm sure if we were like, let's start a protest around like, insurance is too high. Like I can imagine like we would have thousands of people out in the streets because everyone is having the same issue. But I think we can definitely think about like that particular issue and figure out like what are the different things that we can do in these, if you're thinking about doing it through personal transformation, telling stories is a really powerful way of I think it's a powerful tool of organizing, right? So like how do we tell stories about all the horror stories that people have to face when it comes to insurance and all the issues that they've had, and then maybe from there thinking about what are some of the alternatives that we can build, that are in response to these insurance companies that are not, actually for us, right? And maybe that's going to pressure them a little bit to do better. Cool. So what I would have us do is map it out, but I'm trying to see if folks, maybe we'll just do this as a group. So what I would have us do, and like I said, like normally I do this training, like 2-hour training, or like in person. I think if we start doing it in person, I'll probably end up making it like 3 hours or something like that. And so if we were in person, we would have like tape on the floor, and then I would have us actually move like, okay, who are the folks who see themselves as approaching alternative institutional change? Who are the folks that see themselves as changing dominant institutions? And can you keep it down a little bit? I'm doing a training. Thank you. Sorry, there's people in the kitchen. And then there are folks who are, who are folks who are in the personal transformation lens. And so what we do is sort of go in and think about like, what are the organizations that are in these, in this approach? And so take about 5 minutes and list out all the organizations, and then talk about what are all the strengths of this approach, right? And what are all the weaknesses? And I find this to be a really helpful exercise for us to sort of realize like, what and so to really kind of get that information out there, and for us, I think to maybe have like a better definition of some of those approaches, and then sort of go into it. So I think this is an example of what we did with changing dominant institutions. Actually, before I go, do folks want to break out into groups, or would you rather just do it in like a big group? We have a hard stop at 12:30, right?
We do.
Okay, great. So maybe,
I like the big group idea, more mind.
Yeah, let's just do the big group. And so if we're thinking about building dominant, actually, I'm going to go ahead and, so if we're thinking about, let's pick which approach do we want to cover? So we can talk about dominant institution, alternative, or personal transformation, and then we'll go ahead and fill this out. Let's do dominant institution, because I feel like that's probably where most of us are in. So if we're thinking about dominant institutions, can we name some organizations that we know of that are working within dominant institutions? So I would say maybe like unions, like SEIU. I would put them in here. Yeah, where would you put, would Equality Ohio be in here too?
Yep. Definitely.
Cool.
Think of other advocacy organizations too, generally kind of nonprofits or organizations like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say the ACLU and Equitas.
I would put Ohio Voice in here too, because a lot of the work that we do is around civic engagement work. Cool. And then, so I'm sure we can name a whole bunch. What are some of the strengths that come with dominant institutions?
There's capacity to move. There's bigness. I don't know. There's capacity and influence often.
Yep, influence is definitely.
I guess the opportunity to be in the room as well.
Yeah, being in the room is definitely, important, I think, when it comes to dominant institutions. I think along with capacity, I would say a lot of organizations end up having resources that maybe alternatives or like personal transformation folks might not have. Like, I think a lot more money comes into organizations that do like dominant institutional change. Would y'all agree?
Absolutely. I'm just going to add in here, there's some comments from the Whova app too. So resources and then a big footprint where these came.
Cool. Okay, let's move into the weaknesses. What are some weaknesses that come with dominant institutional change?
I'd say sometimes you're stuck in the rules of the system that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of lawyers are kind of stuck living in a transformative space that is not meant to protect the clients that you work to help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes you become the system, right? That you're trying to sort of change. And I think along with this too, sometimes you become too big to fail. I know of some organizations that end up having so many resources and so much influence and so much power that even if they are not serving, their communities, or it's like some sort of toxic culture, they end up, still being in power, because it's like, well, they're already so big, they're so powerful. Like, if they fail, what does that mean for our movement?
That's so insightful. Too big to fail. Just want to uplift some other comments from the Whova app. Change is harder with a large institution, lack of nimbleness. I know one of the analogies that we use at Equality Ohio often is it is so much harder to turn a cruise ship than it is a sailboat, right? So once you get bigger, it just, there's more pieces, there's more weight to turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that I learned, it was a very hard lesson to learn, was, sometimes I think, and this I think maybe can happen in any approach, but, when you're sort of organizing and you're trying to change these like larger systems, right? We're trying to, another sort of framework that has really helped me sort of think about my work is, you know, if we can think about the larger like US or maybe even like Western hemisphere, actually I think at this point it's the whole world, as like the master's house, right? And the master's house is made up of these three pillars, which is white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And these pillars sort of hold up this house, right? And what we try to do as organizers is really try to, I mean, ultimately what we want to, at least for me, I speak for myself, what I want to do is sort of just like make the whole thing collapse, right? Just like get rid of it completely. And blow it all up. But until then, all we can do is sort of chip away at those pillars as much as possible, right? And, you know, again, thinking about movement ecology terms is some of us might have little picks, some of us might have cranes, some of us might have, you know, just lots of people with us, not just, but we might have lots of people with us. And so we're all coming in with different tools and resources that's trying to chip away at these things, right? And some of us might be focusing on one pillar more than the other, or maybe like transitioning from one pillar or the other. But ultimately, I think, you know, sometimes with dominant institutions is we think like, oh, we're fighting against those pillars and that's not going to show up in our work, which is a lie, right? If we're still living, we're still swimming in these waters, right? We're still living under these big systems. And so sometimes I think with dominant institutions, we can easily replicate those pillars in our own work and might not even see it, right? Because we're like, oh, well, we're fighting against that. We're not that. But that's not true because we're humans. And so if we're living in white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, how do we expect it to not show up in our work, right? And the organizations that we work in. And so for me, that was just like a really important thing. I mean, I learned after all of the hurt and all that stuff that happened afterwards, but now reflecting on it, it's like, oh, like that's what was happening, right? And now you know, in these different organizations that I work in, I'm very aware of that. And it's like, what are the things that we have to do internally as dominant like organizations that are working with these dominant institutions to make sure that we're constantly undoing some of that learning, right? And sort of like trying to shift our work as much as possible internally. Because yeah, it might be too big to shift the whole cruise, but if we could start at least from within the organization, from within the core team, from within two staff, therefore it could like replicate a little bit and like reflect the larger organization. Does that make sense? I definitely agree. This is something that I've been talking a lot about with the different folks that I've been working with is I think sometimes as organizers, and especially I think, you know, when you've done it for so long and you're sort of like swimming in that same waters for a while, is that we start talking to each other a lot and trying to convince each other, right? And like trying to convince organizations and other organizers, when in reality, we gotta like look at the public. Like what we're trying to do is like, you know, the definition of organizing to me is we're trying to fundamentally change our communities' lives, right? And so it's really, and a lot of the times our communities don't believe that they deserve it. I worked in the union in SEIU in the 5 for 15 campaign for about 6 months in New York, raising the minimum wage there. At that time, the minimum wage was $8.70 an hour in New York City, which is like the heart of capitalism, right? And my job was to basically go into stores and convince them to testify and give tests and like, you know, be a part of this movement to have $15 an hour. And the hardest thing was to convince them that they deserve it. A lot of the times it would be like, I didn't graduate from high school, or I had a kid when I was young, or, you know, I didn't go to college. Therefore, like, I don't deserve $15 an hour. And it's like, you work 2 jobs, you see your kids, you only see your kid when you're getting them ready for school. Like, you work 80 hours a week, you know, like, how do you think you don't deserve this, you know? So I think for me, it's really important, like you said, like, we need to convince the public, because that's how we get what we want. If we think about Black Lives Matter, when I started, you know, doing some of this work in 2013, people were looking at us like we were crazy. Like, I'd be like, the world is on fire. Can't you see? Like, no, you know, Black Lives Matter. And people in our own work, in my own family, would be like, what are you talking about? Why are you so mad? Sit down. And it's like, like, it's bad out here, you know, like, it's really bad. But until we did a lot of like worked to sort of to convince people like this is not okay, right? And sort of got enough people to sort of like buy in and see, I think it's changed so much, right? If we think about where we were then to where we are now, I mean, it has in certain sense also got corporatized, because now everyone can just say Black Lives Matter, but like it's, you know, we think about all the little minute ways. Like I live in Hilliard right now, which is a suburb outside of Ohio, and all summer there were people outside with Black Lives Matter protests. Like I never thought that I would see that, because it's such a Republican place, right? But it's like changing the hearts and minds like does matter, and it has like real life implications. And I think our job as organizers is to sort of like help people figure out what are those little ways that they can do in their own lives, in their own work, and their own jobs, in order for it to have these larger implications. Okay, cool. So we just did, okay, so we broke it down. And then again, what I had to do is like do this in each part of the pie, right? So do the same thing for personal transformation, alternatives as well. And sometimes we might even break it down with like mass protests inside game structure, because yeah, there's a lot of conversation that we could have there too. And then inevitably and then what I would usually have us do is kind of like, reflect and like share back, like, okay, what are all the strengths and weaknesses? And then think about, and then we'll hear all what the other approaches have shared, and we'll see like what, you know, where people sort of, what's it called? Like we'll see how like some of the strengths of one approach is the weakness of another approach, and vice versa. And also notice some of the conflicts that might happen, right? So if we're thinking about this, if we did the same thing for personal transformation, we'll probably notice that, you know, they don't have a lot of resources, right? Like dominant institutions have. But maybe some of their strengths is like, you know, it has a longer lasting impact, right? They're the type of approach that really, might not have like the biggest or the widest impact, I guess I'm trying to say, like maybe not affect, like, because I think with personal transformation, because it's so long, that maybe you're working with a smaller group of people, right? Rather than changing like these big, huge dominant institutions. And so, yeah, so basically it's like there's different ways. And if we're thinking about it in our own work, sometimes that can show conflict, right? So I can talk for myself, like when I was organizing, and I was very much at one point in mass protest lens, like that's all that I was like, this is how change happens, and that's that. And definitely had a lot of conflict with people who are like in the inside game, because I'd be like, well, you guys don't actually care, and you don't think that change can really happen because you're just in there in your meetings and you don't even know, right? And I didn't like sometimes trust those people, right? I didn't think that they were like smart enough, when in reality it was like we just had a different theory of change. Like they believe that change should happen, they believe like in everything that I believe in, right? But like they just don't want to protest. What they think is gonna be most viable is like being in those rooms and changing those policies and having those meetings. And so what do we do when those conflicts happen? And I'm sure like if y'all are thinking about this right now, you could probably think about when like you've been in a situation where there's been conflict, right? And thinking like, were y'all disagreeing on strategy and tactic, or were you disagreeing on a theory of change? Because sometimes we try to convince each other that something is wrong, or like they should do it this way, but that person just, again, doesn't believe that that's how change happens. So then what do you do, right? From there. Has anyone experienced some of this conflict that I'm talking about? Yeah, right. I know for me, it was actually, I'm not even gonna go there. Yeah, so, and this could be really painful, right? We really, because again, we're all in this work because we believe in making social movements, and we believe in like changing things for our community. And so it could be really painful when our comrades are like talking shit, basically, right? Or maybe not agreeing with what we're saying. And so, and that has real life implications, right? Like I said, I was in mass mass protests for a while, and then eventually got burnt out from that. And then I ended up flipping to inside game, because I was like, okay, we did all these protests, it hasn't worked, people are still dying, people are killing themselves because of how burnt out they are from this work. And so maybe where the change needs to happen is if we start changing some of these policies, right? If we elect people differently, if we register people to vote. And that's when I really got into like civic engagement work, and ended up being in this meeting that was like top 10 leaders of Black Lives Matter, something like that. And we ended up meeting with Hillary Clinton, and I got invited to this meeting, last minute got uninvited. And then I showed up anyways, because I was like, what are they going to do? Kick out a Black Lives Matter leader at this meeting? So I showed up and went to this meeting, and it was like, long story short, it's a very confusing meeting. She thought we were going there to tell her what we thought should happen. We came in there thinking that she was going to tell us what she was going to do. So the first half hour, which is very confusing, like lots of like yelling or whatever. And then eventually got into the groove of it. Everyone around asked her questions, and I asked her about the money that she was getting from private prison corporations, because at that time she was getting money from GEO and all these corporations that were holding a lot of the detention centers. And so when I asked her this, she was like, oh, I didn't know about this. And I was like, how do you not know? Like, you were getting money from these people, they're giving $100,000. She got really mad. She like slammed her hand on the table. It was like, well, I didn't know, just felt very called out. And then I kept pressing, and then eventually she was like, I'll look into it. And then like we leave that meeting, a few hours later, she drops her funds, and then it just becomes a trend. Like all the other candidates also like drop their funds from the private prison corporations, and then it became like a thing, which like maybe it was like a very small change in the larger scheme, but like it meant something, right, to those folks that were in those detention centers. And so I come home like a few weeks later, and I see somebody who was like, an elder in this work, who like I saw kind of like a mentor, basically was like, called me out, like, oh, like you're basically a sellout for sitting in this meeting with Hillary Clinton. And I was like so hurt, like what? Like I didn't even want to be in this meeting. I was uninvited. Like I showed up because my friend asked me to go because she wasn't in the room and she needed me to like ask this question for her. And I remember for like years, I was like not mad, but like very upset at this person, and like didn't really work with them, when it came to stuff. I like became very distant. And then like probably like 2 years later, we see each other at a bar, and I bring it up, and they don't even remember saying it. Like they just said it. And because again, like that's just not where they were at that time. And it just was like, oh, wow. Like I was holding all of this, like, for what, you know what I mean? And so that's just like my personal experience when it comes to this. And I'm sure people probably have lots of stories about this, but that just, for me, it really taught me that like there can be real tension when it comes to this work. And like what we really need in order to have a healthy ecology is to have conversation and like really understanding of like where people are coming from, and really build relationships across these approaches, right? For us to be able to talk it out was like really, really helpful for me. And for him to just be like, no, like I was just like in this particular mindset, or like it was just this type of day. Like, I'm sorry, I wish we would have like talked about it, beforehand, because maybe we could have worked together over those years, but like it just didn't happen that way. And so just thinking like it has real life implications, right? And also like you can't be everything, right? I couldn't be the mass, like, and we acknowledge that too, was like actually the role that you played by being in that room was really important, because it allowed us on the mass protest side to push even further, right? And so again, kind of like to my point earlier, was like it's really important for us to know like what is the role that I'm playing, what is the strategy that I'm in now, how do I do that really well, and how do I stay in communication with people who are in those other approaches, because it's really important, right? And do that with reciprocity. Thank you. We do that with reciprocity because it because that's the only way we're gonna like get past this, right? And be able to have like real understanding of like the social changes that we're trying to have. And yeah, basically conversation, being really understanding, and just realizing like it's not gonna happen overnight, and knowing that these can have really big implications. Like the story that I told was like a very like interpersonal implication, but also I think when it works together well, it could be really powerful, right? There's very like simple and complex ways that we could work together across these approaches. A quick little story here is again around that campaign that I talked about, where you know, we had somebody who was a legislative aide in the state house. They saw the stand your ground bill come across their desk, and then they told us, who was sort of like in the structure / mass protest side of it. And so we were really able to galvanize and do a lot of organizing and sort of connect with like the churches and connect with some of the alternatives to really have like a robust campaign that I think had a lot of implications at that time that were really powerful. So I think if we can sort of, you know, kind of get clear on what it is that we're doing and what is our organization doing, and really figure out like how are we going to relate to other organizations, it could be a really powerful way of doing our work, and you know, to have a better Ohio too. And even thinking about y'all's particular movement with the LGBTQ IA plus rights, right? It's like there's lots of, you know, you have Equitas, you have Be Quick, you have EO, right? There's lots of different ways that people are approaching change through this particular movement. And so how do we create more spaces where people are really having relationships and understanding where other people are coming from, to really have a movement that's going to be a lot more powerful than it being fractured and like not really respecting where other people are coming from, right? But really appreciating it. And that just takes a lot of time and conversation, which I know some of us think we don't have time for, but we're organizers, right? That's what we do, is we talk to people. And so if we're not talking to each other either, then like it's going to be a lot more difficult to do our work. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for coming to the session. If you have any questions or thoughts,